Breaking news, friends. Military airfields in Crimea, Kacha and Belbek are on fire right now. Explosions. No. Something's blowing up over there. There's an airfield there. Damn. I almost lost it for a second. Most of the tactical aviation has been put out of action according to public sources. Something's burning in the center. This isn't... We're preparing for the deoccupation of the peninsula. That's what Sky News reports. That's the goal of the military operations. The Bezuslovniki attacked the Azot plant in Perm and the Orsknefteorgsintez plant in the Orenburg region of Russia. Ukraine may be supplied with long-range Tomahawk and Barracuda missiles, and with their help, not only frontline targets, but also key military sites deep inside Russia are now within reach. Moscow, St. Petersburg, get ready. Truly large-scale blackouts, fuel shortages, and a harsh winter await the racists.
The cockles have hit us. There's no electricity at all here.
At the same time, attacked oil refineries have already put more than 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity out of commission, with losses estimated at $100 billion. Yeah, fucking oil depot, damn it. Russia is effectively experiencing an energy and fuel crisis. Let's discuss the details with well-known military analyst Roman Svetan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Lvovich, let's start with the occupied Crimea. First of all, there's information from Sky News that the armed forces of Ukraine are preparing brilliant special operations to deoccupy the peninsula. This article came out today, I read it, and right now, military airfields in Crimea are on fire. Kacha and Belbek, they're reporting strikes. This is both the long-range Neptune at work and drones as well. What do you think?
Regarding the deoccupation of Crimea, we've been saying for several years that the most optimal option for us is to begin the deoccupation of our territory precisely with Crimea. Crimea is a strategic geographic cauldron squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. The entry and exit points are under our control. If the Kerch Bridge is destroyed, then basically the only way to get into Crimea would be either by sea, which is very problematic, or through land crossings that are completely under our control, since the range there is about 100 kilometers. We can reach it from both sides, and we have the means to do so. In other words, Crimea itself is practically begging to be deoccupied, and what's most interesting is that this can be done without ground. Without a ground or naval operation, including without an amphibious landing and without losses, we can deoccupy it by destroying or forcing out the Russian troops. That is what deoccupation means. The long-range strike assets, only they need to be available in sufficient quantity. The main component is aviation, which in this millennium is used to carry out combat missions. That is precisely this component. And it will allow us to drive out the Russian troops or destroy them depending on their willingness to die. Let's put it that way. After all, it's not for nothing that for several years we've been telling Russians that they need to learn to leave Crimea using freestyle breaststroke and dog paddle. How long has it been now? About 3 years we've been talking about this with you. It's definitely the 4th year now. So now we have such an opportunity, and our special services are taking action to destroy the enemy's air defense. This is what people are talking about, that preparations are underway for a serious attack on Crimea. And it's more or less like this. Without geopolitics or politics, it's purely a technical matter. Like Mossad, or rather the Israeli IDF, struck Iran. Again, I'll repeat, without geopolitics, it's purely a technical mechanism. We took out the Iranian air defense, and after that, over a distance of 1,000 kilometers, while we only have 300, over 1,000 kilometers, their aircraft had to refuel, but we don't need refueling. They entered Iranian territory just as we can enter the airspace with our aircraft, the airspace over Crimea, and then use free-falling high-precision aerial bombs and precisely guided missiles to take out ground targets. This was done, for example, against Iranian military facilities after achieving air superiority 1,000 kilometers from the airbase. So this is exactly a one-to-one operation. There's no need to invent anything new. Everything was thought up 100 years ago at the dawn of aviation. In other words, this kind of mechanism is possible for the deoccupation of Crimea specifically. The Iranians, after all, are primarily a land-based country, and so there is no shared border with Israel, so there was no ground operation, and in principle, it wasn't even necessary. We have the same situation, but for us, it's much simpler. The Russians will have to flee because Crimea, I repeat once again, is an operational geographic cauldron. They will have to run from there or simply perish. Everything will depend on the amount of strike assets. Today we struck Belbek and Kacha. These are Western airfields. The Russians have 5 such airfields that they use in Crimea. 5. 2 of them have already been hit more than once. Why? Because it is precisely these airfield sites that the Russians use to deploy their surface-to-air missile systems and radio-technical troops radars. In other words, the eyes of the Russian air defense begin there. The first eye, roughly speaking, is Kacha. The last eye is the Kerch Bridge, if you stretch it out. So that's roughly how it is. That's why strikes on Kacha, on Belbek, and on the neighboring airfields are the beginning of gaining air superiority, which will now be carried out by our special services, special operations forces, unmanned systems forces, in other words, the defense forces of Ukraine. When the actual air attack on Crimea happens, it will have to involve missiles, meaning a sufficient number of missiles. Ours will work very well, and not just the long-range ones. Neptune has a range of 280 kilometers. It can reach at least the middle of Crimea, and depending on the launch point, almost all the way to Kerch. This is the basic Neptune, so-called, which we have in sufficient quantity, coastal missile systems. This is our missile, which has been in service for more than a year, since 2018, and is carrying out combat missions. The long-range Neptune is possible too, meaning with a slightly greater range, it can reach up to 1,000 kilometers all the way to the Caucasus. That's if the attack goes in that direction. Aviation components. We already have a 2nd brigade of F-16s coming in. 2 brigades of F-16S are enough to carry out a military operation, an air operation, I mean, using airstrike assets, missile and bomb strikes without ground or naval operations. So let's wait. That is when the aircraft arrive, when they come together with the planes, it's a platform. We need a sufficient amount of weaponry to carry out such an attack. Because as soon as we're ready, the main thing is that the Russians are ready. I'll say it again, freestyle, breaststroke, dog paddle.
Roman Grigorievich, well, for some reason, Sky News wrote that before winter, Ukraine might launch a large-scale attack on Crimea. This could be, quote, either a naval landing by Ukrainian forces or a massive attack on the Kerch Bridge. What do you think?
Well, I would argue about the naval part. Why? A naval landing is possible in 3 locations, realistically, in order to accomplish a specific task, and based on the capabilities we have. It's not Crimea. It's the the Tendrov Spit and Skadovsk, the port of Skadovsk. But all of these are on the Black Sea coast of southern Ukraine. In other words, it's the mainland coast, basically the left bank of the Dnipro. In principle, for an amphibious landing, the objective of any landing operation, not just amphibious, but also airborne, ground, any kind of landing, is to seize, that is, to make a rapid advance by various means, capture and hold a bridgehead until the main forces arrive. As for Crimea, if you try to land an amphibious force there, that's basically a suicide mission. So obviously no one is going to do that because ground forces definitely won't be able to approach, since it would still take another 6 months to a year of airstrikes to deal with Crimea. But for example, the Kinburn Spit, the Tendrov Spit, and Skadovsk, that's a port. By the way, that's 50 kilometers from Crimea. So for example, to carry out a combat mission of a naval landing, say, in the port of Skadovsk, and hold it until the main forces arrive, which let's say will cross the Dnipro from Kherson, not from Oleshki. And basically there's a direct road, a straight road through Holapristan. They'll reach Skadovsk, cut off this triangle almost along the left bank of the Dnipro, and it will be possible to hold it. So in this scenario, there are possibilities. Yes, this is the direction toward Crimea, but it's not Crimea itself. That's why when it comes to a naval landing, our journalist partners were a bit hasty, to put it mildly. But the Kerch Bridge, its liberation needs to begin. Why? Because the Kerch Bridge is yours, and it's precisely that logistical chain through which 30% of military ammunition and equipment passes through Crimea to Kherson and the Zaporizhzhia fronts. It's clear that we need to target it first and foremost. The downside is that it's difficult to do. Why is that? But the numerous and uneven defense system means that almost all our missiles, all our efforts are intercepted. It needs to be taken down with ballistic missiles. There need to be enough Perm missiles, several dozen of them. Perm 1, Perm 2, it doesn't matter, depending on the range. 300 kilometers is basically possible. That's the only way to break through and overcome the Russian air defense, specifically over Moscow and the Kerch Bridge.
Roman Lvovich, when we talk about the military airfields at Kacha and Belbek, is the enemy's tactical aviation currently stationed there? In what numbers? Because you and I don't know, we discuss strikes on Kacha and Belbek almost twice a month. This happens regularly.
Those two airfields are used as forward operating bases, meaning they host tactical aviation, mainly the Russian Federation's naval aviation, and there are always army aviation units, helicopters stationed there as well. Helicopters that are used to counter our surface and aerial drones. That is, the helicopters can operate up to an altitude of 1 kilometer. By the way, this is actually the only, well, not the only, but one of the main means of destruction that the Russian Federation uses against our drones, including aerial drones. They simply have a lot of helicopters, and the entire range of their helicopter fleet is army aviation. And so at forward airfields like Belbek and even more so at Kacha, they are stationed there. They have reloading and refueling points there. In other words, a whole process is set up. They're not the main bases, but as forward airfields, they fulfill their purpose.
Roman Grigorievich, now regarding the strikes on oil refineries and other targets, we attacked the Azot plant in Perm, Orsknefteorgsintez and Orgsintez in the Orenburg region. What do you think about that?
Well, now we know where the Russian orcs come from Ork. Yes, from there. Our specialists have highlighted it. This is where the orc lair is located. So roughly in that area. But seriously, of course, we've talked about this before, and in principle, our listeners should be prepared for it. The next stage in destroying the Russian economy is through the destruction of Russia's chemical industry, meaning the oil and gas sector. Not just one, but almost all of Russian chemistry. Well, the kind that mainly uses gas is tied to the oil and gas sector. So why are they now targeting the chemical industry, for example? And our drones are even flying as far as 1,500 kilometers. But the main goal, first of all, is to try to completely destroy this plant. That possibility exists. Take the plant that was hit, the Perm plant. In addition to producing ammonia and so on, it also produced ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is used in the production of explosives and in large quantities. For us, it's very important to take the chemical industry out of the equation for this purpose, to prevent Russian, let's say, powder plants from producing explosives. So ammonium nitrate, among other things, is also highly explosive. If anyone remembers, a few years ago in Lebanon, in Beirut, there was an explosion of ammonium nitrate, Russian, by the way. At that time, a Russian ship had docked there. It was either standing or unloading, and then suddenly it exploded, as they say. So this kind of sudden explosion can be organized at any chemical plant that produces ammonium nitrate. That is, and this Perm plant was producing it. Well, and the Orsk plant, that's basically, you could say, an oil refinery. Mainly it produces gasoline, diesel, and aviation kerosene. This Orsk plant is very important for us. And the next one after it, if you go further east, about 3,000 kilometers, the Orsk plant, the refinery, that is the oil refinery. So that's the Orsk one. From there are the Orsk people, that's Orsk, right? And then further on under Kazakhstan, yes, that's Omsk. So in Omsk, there is an oil refinery, the largest in Russia, with an annual processing capacity of 21 million tons. That means it's serious money, and it's essential to reach it and stop this oil refining. Yes, they do process some Kazakh oil there, but still the money comes from the refining, so it's necessary to get to it. Well, since they've already reached Orsk, I think they'll make it to Omsk too.
Roman Igorevich, so according to the dry statistics, analysts write that the attacked refineries have already put more than 40% of Russian oil refining capacity out of commission, and losses are estimated at over 100 billion. But when I talk to economists, they look at me and say Putin doesn't care. The population might have to stand in line for gasoline, the queues could be enormous, there could be a fuel and energy crisis, they'll get through it. This will not affect Russia's ability to conduct military operations against Ukraine in any way. Roman Ilyich, I'd like to discuss this with you.
Well, through pressure on Russian civil society, it definitely won't have any effect, and Putin really doesn't care. But our goal isn't to put pressure on Russian society. As we've said many times before, that's a side effect, so to speak. The side effect of what? Of the fact that most of the fuel which is still being produced at other plants is going to the army. So to put it simply, just to understand the process, if a tank crewman and a tractor driver are fighting over diesel, the tank crewman will win. Guess why in 3 tries? The tank crewman has a gun on his tank, while the tractor driver at best has nothing in his pocket. So naturally, the tractor drivers are left without fuel, and the tank crewmen complete their combat missions. Putin knows this perfectly well. So basically, he doesn't pay any attention to it at all. Well, only Putin and all those military types. They absolutely and unequivocally don't care at all about what Russian civilians will ultimately be driving. That's just a mere side effect. It's essentially like turning a bustling gas station into a desolate parking lot. In other words, it's effectively a penalty area, a zone of significant disadvantage. All civilian cars will come to a stop, but that won't affect the military in any way at all, in order to actually affect fuel supplies to the army. For that, you need to destroy the entire, not just 40%, but the entire oil refining industry in Russia, plus cut off the flow of foreign currency. That's why we're continuing to strike at the chemical industry. As we discussed before, expect more strikes on the chemical industry. Here they are, strikes on the chemical industry. Let's make a prediction. The next strikes will target Russian metallurgy and energy sectors, because the next stage is precisely the destruction. Metallurgy, which brings a significant amount of revenue to the Russian treasury. And of course, the energy sector, which powers the Russian Federation's military industry. There will definitely be strikes, 100%. This is already the third stage. In order to prevent the Russian army from being supplied with fuel, it means the entire oil and gas sector of Russia needs to be taken down, plus the natural flow of this currency, including petrodollars, needs to be cut off so that they can't buy, like they're already starting to do now, diesel and gasoline abroad, as it's called. They're already trying to buy processed fuel from the Chinese and Indians, made from someone else's oil, in other words, to bring it back in. And in order to stop the Russian army completely, the Russian economy needs to be brought down to zero so that they can't even afford to buy this gasoline and diesel. After that, as we've already said ourselves, they'll switch to donkeys, which now they bleat and mumble, but they don't want to go to war. The donkeys are going, but the little donkeys aren't. Donkeys meaning the Russian ones, these federists. But as for the little donkeys, that's it. They're all gone. Right now, a donkey costs more than a motorcycle. That's why Russian bloggers and public pages are practically flooded with offers to buy motorcycles for Russian soldiers. That's about how much it costs. A bottle of water and a motorcycle, especially in Donbass, there's no water at all there. You can't even tell what they're pouring into those bottles there. That's why this process is happening. Then to stop it completely, to stop the Russian army, you need to cut off these two flows. That is fuel production, and currency, without stopping the inflow of foreign currency. But stopping the army will be
very difficult. Dear viewers, please like this video and support our content. With Roman Grigorievich, every like from you is priceless. And in the comments, let us know where you're watching from, your location. Roman Grigorievich, you are watching. President Zelensky, I believe it was the day before yesterday, said that until now, we have attacked Russia exclusively with Ukrainian-made weapons, but now the situation may change, Zelensky said. And here, two pieces of news emerge. First, the US is providing Ukraine with intelligence data. For missile strikes deep inside Russia, that means oil refineries, pipelines, power plants, and other facilities, including those in Moscow and St. Petersburg. This is the first time that the Trump administration will be assisting Ukraine in carrying out strikes using long-range missiles against targets deep within Russian territory. And the second piece of information is that the possibility of supplying Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk and Barracuda missiles is currently being considered. Roman Grigorievich, how would you comment on this?
We know perfectly well where the Russian power plants, pumping stations, and pipelines are located. They all date back to the Soviet Union. It's very important for us to have the locations of Russian air defense systems in real time. This is the kind of information the Russians can share with us so that our drones can reach their targets. A drone is flying, let's put it simply. How long did the drone take to reach Orsk? It's about 1,500, more than 1,500 kilometers at a speed of 150 kilometers per hour. That's 10 hours. So in those 10 hours, it could be shot down 300 times, and it needs to have a flight route that avoids all the strike zones, all the areas controlled by Russian air defenses, which in fact are not that many anymore if the drone has already passed through the front line air defenses. But you need to know exactly and specifically which air defense system is there and at what altitude it can engage targets. How to bypass them, at what speeds, at what altitudes to fly under the beam, that is below the radio horizon. It's an entire process. And without intelligence data of this level, and the Americans can see all of this, they have everything from radio intelligence to satellite monitoring. They can see everything perfectly, where each Russian station is activated, how far its range is, and so on. This data gives us the opportunity even with our own weapons, to get through and complete the combat mission. Well, we've already talked about OS, we've talked about Perm. In other words, we've reached them. Now, a question about missiles. Well, I don't believe they'll give us Tomahawks. I don't believe it for one simple reason. If they were ready to give us Tomahawks, they would have already given us JASSMs for the F-16s we have and ATACMS for the HIMARS we have. So it's more just talk, really. Technically, it's possible. It's not that it's impossible, you know. At this stage, it's really a sea-launched missile, a missile launched from ships. But a few years ago, a program was launched to restore ground-based launches, the so-called mobile ones. A sufficient number of launches have already been created. Typhoon or Typhon, as they're also called, depending on the translation. Typhoon. These launchers make it possible to fire, that is, to launch a Tomahawk missile from them. It's the same, basically, it's the same Mk-41 launch silo, the naval one. They just took it off and mounted it on a vehicle chassis, and after that, it can carry out a combat mission. But let me repeat myself. Why don't I believe it at this stage? Why? Because we've already been promised JASSMs. We already have a second F-16 brigade. Not a single JASSM has arrived. By the way, they were even less willing to give us cruise missiles. This issue could have been resolved, but they're afraid. So if they're afraid to give us JASSMs, do you really think they'll give us Agat? But something like, say, the Barracuda, well, that's not quite the same. You could call it a drone missile. You said it wasn't the Barracuda. Yes, I was talking about the Barracuda. So the Tomahawk is still a cruise missile, medium range, and its range is about 2,000 kilometers, give or take 500, depending on the configuration. And the Barracuda has a range of 500 kilometers, but nevertheless, it can carry a 500 kilogram warhead. So this missile, by and large, can be considered short range. The Barracuda is roughly comparable to the Taurus. Only the Taurus costs millions of euros, while the Barracuda is a few $100,000. It's simpler. Yes, it's easy to produce, meaning it can be made in large quantities. Like our Polyanitsia, for example, or the same Flamingo. We only have some videos, some teasers. We just hear about them. But in reality, let's say the Barracuda is already entering production now, and in half a year we might get it, but we won't get it tomorrow. It's only just starting production. We'll probably get the ERAM sooner. So there is a missile that they've basically already started producing for us, and we can get them sooner. Because we're waiting, of course, for the weapons we've ordered. It's much simpler. I've already explained this on my fingers to give us what we already have launchers for. We have HIMARS, we have about 50 HIMARS, ATACMS, no problem. A 300-kilometer missile could already be in use. There are already several squadrons of F-16S carrying out combat missions, but what level of combat missions are they really performing? They're chasing flies with fly swatters. In other words, they're using cannons, roughly speaking, against Shaheds or Gerans. So if they were given the opportunity at least 100 JASSMs to strike at a range of 500 kilometers, the same 500 kilometers, the same 500 kilograms warhead, Moscow would be gone. They talk about a blackout, for example. Imagine what a blackout in Moscow would be like, or a blackout in Kyiv. It's nothing terrible. How is it in Kyiv? Why is it nothing terrible? First of all, the population density isn't the same anymore. Some people have left. Secondly, we've already gotten used to it. We're prepared now. We know how to handle these issues, how to ensure vital services. And besides, Kyiv's population is still several times smaller than Moscow's. Just imagine, tens of millions. Nobody even knows how many mouths there are to feed in Moscow. Now, just imagine how many behinds there are in Moscow, and if all of them go to the bathroom at the same time in a single day, but there's no water. There won't be any color. Let's just say there will be a certain Russian spirit in the air, and the smell will be so strong that it will seriously reach a radius of about 1,500 kilometers, at least as far as the Urals, that's for sure. It would just be a humanitarian catastrophe, and a sudden one at that. By the way, that's one way to kill off all the battle mosquitoes. They'd just die from that Russian stench. So there would be a real problem. And that possibility does exist. If we were given those JASSMs, even just 100 of them, that Russian spirit would reach all the way to the Urals.
Roman Grigorievich, when Zelensky says that previously we only used Ukrainian long-range strike systems, but now that's no longer the case, I'm curious, what is he talking about? What long-range missiles is he referring to? Is it the European ones? What is President Zelensky talking about? So what non-Ukrainian weapon could reach deep into Russian territory?
Well, what is he talking about? This is a question millions of people have been asking for years, at least Ukrainians. So it's very hard for me to decipher, so to speak. But realistically, from what we might have at this stage, I've basically already mentioned it. We have a platform, so what can fly quickly? Attackams can. The ones that have already been used, 300 kilometers. What 300 kilometers? Look here. A 300-kilometer ATACMS can reach Kursk, Bryansk, Voronezh, Belgorod, and Rostov. That's 5 regional cities along the border, meaning cross-border cities. And that's not even mentioning Crimea or other Russian cities. So that's just what ATACMS can reach. If we get PRSM, by the way, the Americans are now switching to PRSM, then for the same, the HIMARS launcher, for example, can fire 2 missiles at once, not just one, 2 PRSM missiles per block. Its range is not 500 kilometers, but up to 1,000, meaning it can reach Moscow. So creating a blackout in Moscow is actually very simple. About 100 PRSMs would guarantee a blackout there. And that's not even mentioning the JDAM ERs, which could be dropped from F-16s. So that's what could happen. That would, of course, help us a lot, not to mention the scalps, Storm Shadows, or, for example, the Taurus missiles. There's a lot that could be said about the Taurus missiles. The issue now is, well, let's say none of our planes can carry the Taurus yet, and the F-16 can't carry them either. The Gripen can. So not ruling out the possibility that if we get Gripens, even just a pair of planes, though they usually transfer them in groups of 4, then we could also get the Taurus missiles. Those also have a range of 500 kilometers, which means they can reach Moscow as well. Because we keep waiting and waiting, and maybe later we'll understand what our great leaders are talking about.
As you always say about the Moscow bathhouse, hello? Roman
Igorovich,
Let's talk about drones over the territory of the European Union and NATO countries. So, for the first time, 15 drones were detected at night in Belgium over a military base. Airports were shut down. Then drones appeared in Munich. Everyone was in shock. Civil aviation, airports, they temporarily suspended their operations, a blanket plan. Then, at Valdai, Putin is asked, well, as they say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, how long are you going to keep launching drones? He says there will be many of them, but you understand it's not us, it's just some guys messing around over there. And in this way, essentially, Putin announced that a huge number of drones would be roaming the skies over the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance. Roman Lvovich, what does this indicate from a military standpoint?
Well, on the coast, for example, there is probably much more of an economic pressure there. For instance, why exactly did they choose to go there? The primary Nabulina reserves are carefully kept there, specifically the significant securities that she personally placed there, amounting to approximately 200 billion euros. We're talking quite specifically about our particular person, Nabulina. What is her true background? Is she a Tatar or perhaps a pure-blooded Ukrainian? That's one very important thing to consider. So that's probably one of the main reasons why they are currently flying over the country of Belgium. A purely military reason, there's a base in Belgium where the American nuclear stockpile is located. NATO countries. There are several countries in NATO that have their own nuclear weapons. These are France, Britain, and the United States. And American nuclear weapons, about 150 nuclear warheads, are also stationed in 5 other countries. In Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. And so naturally, there's a base in Belgium. And that's why the Russians, of course, will now try at the very least to find some ways to approach these bases as well. The flights of these drones are not so harmless. They're not so harmless. This isn't a provocation. This is already combat. This is the execution of a combat mission. What do the drones do? They create what's called a digital map of the area, approaching certain targets and starting to photograph them, converting the images into digital form, which can then be uploaded into missiles, into the missile's guidance system, into the missile's onboard memory. Who here has heard of onboard memory? Well, that's exactly what these photographs are, the ones that are taken first. Using those same drones are then uploaded, and the missile on the terminal phase of its trajectory, when it approaches the target and electronic warfare systems try, for example, to disrupt it by cutting off its control and satellite communication. But at that point, it no longer needs a satellite connection if it has machine vision. In other words, it's a bunch of photographs that it uses to simply home in on the target, but these photos need to be taken. They need to be taken from the air from certain angles. So what are these drones doing? Because to be honest, I don't understand. Why aren't they being shot down? This is preparation for serious strikes, for specific attacks using the means of destruction that the Russians have. Well, if we have them like Neptune, just so you know, this information is actually publicly available. And it also homes in on the target using exactly this kind of machine vision. Why is it that electronic warfare systems practically don't affect it? Well done, KB Lucchini, right away, even before. Why, for example, fight against electronic warfare? For what purpose? If you can completely disconnect from the satellite and carry out the combat mission in exactly this way, it's just a different approach, different frequencies, wavelengths being used, a different set of these digital images, but nevertheless, that's basically the principle. That's why for Europeans, shoot down everything that buzzes, especially over military facilities, otherwise something will buzz by later that you definitely won't like.
Friends, please like this video and write in the comments if the kitty has sent support to our tandem. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss key military and political topics. Roman Grigorievich is our military analyst, sometimes a psychologist, sometimes a psychiatrist, when he evaluates the actions of the Russians and Putin, but we always provide clear analysis. The well-known military analyst Roman Svetlan. Roman Igorovich, thank you very much. And as usual, see you again on Monday.
Goodbye.